Hello, this is Garrick, and I'll be doing a tutorial demo of how to use correction layers to create a pseudo holographic effect in Clip Studio Paint. This is for the tips of the month for September 2020. Due to the nature of the effect that we will be generating, I have to give you an advisory warning because the method provided here will have very rapidly changing colors, which are essentially flashing lights. And this may impact people who are prone to headaches and or seizures. So if you are one of those people who are affected by rapidly flashing colors, please stop here and find another video to watch. And that will be it for the advisory warning. For more technical details on the effect that I will be generating, please consult the video information on YouTube for the link to the written tutorial on Clip Studio tips. Alright, now that we've gotten the introductory section out of the way, let's actually begin. So for the tips, we're actually supposed to go for finishing. How to finish your work with correction layers, but yeah, in a sense, for the holographic effect, you kind of do both. Part of it is that you actually need the you kind of draw part of it in a sense when you're making your correction layer. So in a sense, you're actually drawing, but at the same time, it's also used as a finishing method, I suppose. Anyhow, we will start off with generating our shapes to create the effect. Okay. So there are two effects that I will demonstrate using the correction layers. One of them is more suitable for simpler shapes, and the other is better for shapes with a lot of faces. So I will start off with the method for simpler shapes using this sphere. So first the shadow. Let me check. Oh. Oh, I'm on the wrong tool. That was gradient erase. Okay, that's the reverse. So to generate the shadow, I will be using the gradient tool. Normally when you make gradients, this is the default setting, foreground to transparent. I will be going into the advanced settings and reversing that. So we'll save this gradient for later. And now we will go for foreground to transparent. And this is the result. We will go into layer settings, clip to layer below. Like this. And now you have a fairly nice 3D looking sphere. And then we'll change this to a highlight. Voila! This is what we will be working off of. So to create the effect, we will use the correction layers, a combination of correction layers actually. So the first one that I will introduce is the gradient map. This is the more important one for this effect because what we will be doing is change these values into colors and then we will animate them. So first off is the, oh, I didn't choose the right gradient map. So by default, the first option for gradient map is the flat color, the drawing color to background color. Anyhow, what you need to do is, if you're selecting one of the gradient sets, is to double click it. And if you're going to manually adjust your gradient map, you want to click over here along this line to add another point, and then you want to select the point and choose the color that you want it to be. So this is if you're doing it manually, and you can move the points around as you like. And basically they'll change, the gradient map will change values found into the corresponding color. And then you can reverse your gradient map. And if you select a node, trash, delete points. Anyhow, what I will be using is the rainbow preset because this is, well, simpler to use. You can adjust this as you like, but as this more or less fulfills our needs already as is, I will be using it as is. So here, gradient map. This already covers the rainbowy effect of what you will find with on holographic stickers. So we don't want this gradient map to cover the entire surface of our image, so we are going to do either one of two things. The first is to, okay, I'm moving the highlight above everything else, above our gradient map. So the first is to right click your gradient map and set clip to layer below, and then it will clip down to the layer below. If you already have another layer, it will clip down to the base layer. So as you can see, I can hide the layer below the gradient map and it will still clip to the base layer. If I hide the base layer, everything disappears. So that is clip to layer below. We have another option actually. We will take all of these layers and move them into a folder. This is something a bit, I guess it's a little unusual if you're not familiar with working with folders. But yeah, this is something that happens when you move your layers into folders. Basically, if there are color mixing layers, they will only reference what is within the folder itself, and everything outside of it is not referenced. At least that's kind of what I'm seeing. Not 100% sure that this applies to everything, but in the case of this gradient map or the correction layers, this is what's happening. So I will reveal this and demonstrate it as well. So as you can see, I've moved this object into the folder, and it is now also being affected by the gradient map. If I clip the gradient map to the layer below, presumably on a single object, it will only affect that. Everything within the chain of layers within the clip to layer below for that object. So for all of these, for everything within the layer referenced. Okay. Move that up. What next? Okay, so this is the first correction layer that we need. The second one that we need is a value correction layer. So we actually have 5 options for that. There's the brightness and contrast, hue, saturation, luminosity, where we only use the luminosity, reverse gradient, level correction, and tone curve. So I will not be demonstrating all of these. Brightness and contrast, basically you will brightness and contrast and luminosity have one glaring weakness, which is that you can only move in one direction, as in brighter or darker, essentially. So if you are working with grays, you will only be able to move in one direction of the gradient map. So if you were using like a aqua, cyan, and then you wanted to add value or subtract value, you'd only be getting this part of the gradient or this part of the gradient map. So that is one of the weaknesses for brightness and contrast for the mid values. Reverse gradient is a good option if you are working with values going from all the way from black to white, but reverse gradient is very poor when working with mid values because the gradient map is only being flipped, so you end up with only the middle sections if you're working with grays. So you will not be reaching the ends, which would be the black and whites, or the darker grays, or brighter. Tone curve, you have options, I guess. I generally use it as the reverse gradient with some additional options. So for this one, if you do, if you change to 0 value for your input to the 255 value and the 255 value to 0 as its output, you'll essentially have the reverse gradient effect. So I'll go ahead and hide that layer, new correction layer, reverse gradient. So I'm just switching these by turning them visible, and you can see that they're quite literally the same effect. The difference is reverse gradient, you can't change anything with. Tone curve, you can adjust slightly. So I will adjust the curve, and now we've shifted all of these around. So one of the big weaknesses with the reverse gradient is that when you turn the opacity down to 50%, I will hide this highlight. So when you turn it down to 50%, basically the colors blend together, and because they're opposite, they're complementary colors, they end up neutralizing each other. So they end up being a gray. So this is one of the things that happens with the reverse gradient, and why it's probably not quite as desirable as the tone curve, because you simply do not have as much flexibility. With the tone curve, you can mitigate the effect by shifting the output value a little bit, so you don't end up generating the same neutral negation effect when you hit 50%. So you can still see that there's a bit of a pattern, because we've sort of dodged the negation effect by setting some of the values to not neutralize each other. So that is the tone curve, and then the last correction layer is the level correction. So for level correction, you would be mostly working with the RGB, and you can adjust the output. So it becomes white or black, depending on what you want. That would only go one way. And this way you can also mess with the output as well, or the input, output. So there are ways to mess with this one. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with this particular correction layer tool, but if you know what you're doing, it is a very good choice for your mid values for creating the holographic effect. Okay, so right now we have the layers created, but the actual organization that we want isn't like this. So what we want is to actually have the gradient map layer be above all of these, so you can see the tone changes. So right now you can see we're just gradually shifting the opacity of the tone curve, and it is moving the colors around through the gradient map. So that is essentially the holographic effect for simpler surfaces. But as you can see, we aren't actually animating it yet. So in order to animate this, we need to create a timeline. So for this, we will go with the 24 frames per second, and playback time, I guess we'll just go for 24 frames. So here's our timeline. Now to animate this, we will be basically doing what we just did with when we were sliding around the opacity on the tone curve layer. So select the tone curve layer and hit the enable keyframes on this layer. So what happens when you do this is you will no longer be able to change the pixel information on that layer. So layer mask, which we aren't using, cannot be edited. But the tone curve itself can still be adjusted a little bit if you need to. And you can change the opacity as well. So keyframes enabled. Now we go into the graph editor, and you will see that opacity is not visible right now. And if you're familiar with the graph editor with file objects, you will notice that these are specifically designating that your mask can be modified through the keyframe animation. But we're not actually going to be animating the mask because we're not using a mask. Anyhow, turn the opacity graph on, and we will go ahead and adjust the opacity. So to navigate this better, we will right-click and drag towards the right to zoom in. Right-click and drag to the left is to zoom out. And then right-click, and drag up to zoom in for the y-axis, and then drag down to zoom out on that axis as well. So what we want to do is zoom in enough to see the 0 and the 100 value on the graph. We'll hit the end of graph, set another keyframe somewhere in the middle, and set another keyframe. So with the opacity, the only values that can be affected are 0 through 100, but the graph editor allows you to set values that are much higher or much lower. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a pain to navigate because all of the values are everything's present all at once, I guess. And they're all using the same number system, but the type of numbers that everything uses is very different. So it's a mess. Anyhow, we've set one value, set another, and a keyframe, and that's basically it. Set that to play, and here we go. Of course, you can make this a lot more erratic. By adding more keyframes, swerving around the values much more drastically. And this is the part that I warned people about. The flashing lights and colors. But yeah, generally you don't want to set your values to be too high or too low. So you don't want to go above 100 and you don't really want to go below 0, because once you do, you're going to get an area that is at 100 for a few seconds or below 0 for a few seconds, and basically that will make your animation stagnate at those particular points, which will be a little bit awkward. Okay, that is the first part of the effects. And we'll just add the highlight back in. And voila, it's kind of there. You would probably not have this effect by itself. You would be using it as an accompanying effect. So to demonstrate that, I will go ahead and make a new copy of the layer, lower the opacity of this version, change this one to another color. Ah, right. That is within the folder. It is still being affected. So that. Um, so something like this. And that is it for the simple version. The more complicated version, yeah, we'll go ahead and generate our object, I guess. So now we have our 3 objects, and we will basically just copy the previous animation, which should still apply. Oops, that was not the right thing to delete. That was only the mask. So now we have this for the top part. Unfortunately, this is only a middle gradient, so the tone curve did not do very much. We're going to change that. Input, output, try this. Okay. I think this should do something. Probably. I mean, it is doing something. I'm not sure if this is enough. Oh, we might as well experiment with the other effects. So we need to select these two layers and have them clip to the top because we only want to affect that piece. Now we will need to create a new gradient map. So we'll just copy the gradient map onto those. Create a new correction layer. We will go with brightness and no, we want oh right, we were using grays. So we can actually undo that. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and undo the grays and turn them into black. And then correction layer, use saturation luminosity. Just go with full luminosity. And then same steps. Opacity. Twink, twink, twink. For objects with multiple facets or faces, we can do something a little different from what we've done for the sphere, and that is to basically go crazy with the color adjustments. For simpler objects with essentially one or two faces, you want to be able to map the where the colors are moving around. But in the case of more complex shapes, you don't really need to follow that. So what I'm going to do is basically go crazy with the color changes. So you can see that this one is just flashing a whole ton of different colors everywhere. This one's a bit more tame. And then we need to adjust the one on the right. And since we were using the tone curve one with less erratic adjustments, we're going to go ahead and mess that up. So it's kind of working in creating a somewhat three-dimensional effect. So what you would actually do is, if you're going to be making this a crystal sort of thing, you'd go in and actually divide up one of these surfaces, at least one of these surfaces a bit more, and maybe add in another shade for color adjustment, possibly another one of the effects. I think you would just do something like new layer, layer setting, clip to layer below. Which one of these is it? Oh, that's the top one. Let's move this over to the left side. And we'll select that. Go to edited layer only. So we would pick a section, do something, add glow, show to add glow. Or should it be overlay? Nope, let's go. Let's just go with add glow. So something like that. And you just apply that to maybe one or two other surfaces, and then add a highlight. So we'll just add a highlight here. That's a really bad highlight. But yeah, this basically how the effect works in a nutshell, or how to create the effect. And thank you for watching. And hopefully I did not, hurt your eyes with this tutorial demo.